Good morning and welcome to Day 2 of the National Tornado Summit and Disaster Symposium. Please welcome back Co-Chair of the National Tornado Summit, Dr. Patrick Marsh.
Good morning and welcome back. I hope you were able to attend the Twister Mixer last night and took time to visit with our exhibitors this morning. But before I continue on with the program this morning, as a social media junkie, you know, millennials and that sort of thing, we got to do a selfie. So hold on. Apparently I'm not a good millennial. Apparently I broke the selfie stick. As you can see, I've never actually used one of these before. Man, I feel like I'm letting my generation down. So, thank you very much. So while we're doing, as we get ready, if you want to be in the selfie and you're on the wings, you might want to move to the middle. If you're in the middle and you don't want to be in the selfie, you might want to move to the wings. Man, everybody's a critic. My camera's breaking. They wanted to take a time lapse. All right. All right. All right, so 3, 2, 1. All right, we got a selfie. I appreciate the audio music. All right, so yesterday's impactful sessions have already inspired most of us to improve in preparedness, response, and recovery. And we still have so much to look forward to as we begin the final day of the summit. Throughout today's sessions, remember that you must get your name badge scanned as you enter sessions and stay throughout the duration of the session for full credit. Also, remember to go to www.sli.do or Slido and enter event code NTS 2019 and click join. Here you can ask questions of our speakers, and also if you don't want to ask a question, you can vote on questions that have been asked, and that'll help us moderators know which questions are most pressing. Today's breakfast is sponsored by the National Association of Mutual Insurance Companies. And here to bring greetings, please welcome their Southwestern Regional Vice President, Paul Martin.
Thank you so much. I am grateful to be here today. I'm more grateful, however, that no one handed me a selfie stick to use because I'm not a millennial and I'm afraid that that would have been a great source of entertainment for my stepdaughter who thinks I'm uncool. But thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. We are grateful to be a sponsor. This is my first time here. How many first-timers here? Okay, in the Kliegel likes, I have no idea. Maybe one, maybe all of you, I have no idea. But thank you for joining us today. We're proud to be a sponsor here. The National Association of Mutual Insurance Companies is the largest trade association, insurance trade association in America. We have over 1,400 member companies doing business, including a number of domicile companies here in Oklahoma. A number of our members are proud sponsors of the Tornado Summit as well, and so we're joining them in this effort today. Why do we care about resilience? Most of you, if I ask you that question, you'd say, well, you care about resilience because you want to pay less at claim time, and there is some truth to that. We take money in from policyholders and we keep that money so that when the next disaster comes, we're ready to make them whole again. But it's more than just paying money. It's more than just being there to write that check at claim time. Our industry makes a significant investment in resilience. We're saving lives by investing in building technology. So it's less about whether the house will be there, it's more about saving the lives of the people in it. We're also investing in ways to reduce property damage, because when we reduce property damage, what we're doing is making sure that payrolls in those small towns can be met. We're making sure, for those of you who work in emergency management and who work for counties and cities, that those sales tax revenues and those property tax revenues, those payments can be made to keep your community strong. And we're also encouraging people to take preparedness personally. Whenever we get people more prepared personally, that's less of an impact on first responders, as well as the volunteer organizations, many of whom are represented here today, have to help in times of disaster. One of the things we did a few years ago was to create some organizations and fund some organizations to do the research. One of our crowning achievements was the funding of the IBHS laboratory in South Carolina. I'm sure you've seen those videos on YouTube of the two houses. My wife and I recently moved into a house we actually built it to IBHS fortified gold standards for high wind and hail. When I live in Austin, Texas, and we talked to a number of builders about this, and they looked at me like I wanted to put a UFO landing pad in my backyard when I said I want to build a fortified. My wife's a CPA, much smarter than I am. Everything on the build was on the spreadsheet. And she says, I'm not so sure about this fortified stuff. I just don't see the value, but we'll go ahead and do it. We moved in May of 2017, and in August of 2017, Hurricane Harvey came ashore, and as the winds picked up and the rain came down, she looked at me and she says, I'm beginning to understand this resilient building. And I wrote that down because it's one of the few times in my marriage where it's determined that I was right about something. And I can't remember a time since, but I still remember that day because that was really important. We also helped found the Build Strong Coalition. And for those of you who heard Pam Williams' excellent presentation yesterday, as a result of that coalition, as a result of Build Strong efforts, we had the Disaster Recovery Reform Act passed. That's going to give states and counties more money at disaster time at the end of the day to rebuild and make communities stronger, so we can end this cycle of building over and building over and building over every time there's a disaster. To celebrate that, NAMIC is proposing a Resiliency Week, and we're introducing proclamations and resolutions in various state legislatures across the country to make the first week of September National Resiliency Week. Not only to honor those of you who do this work, but also to encourage state governments and encourage individuals to get better prepared. And let's start having a conversation about, rather than just rebuilding, let's rebuild smart. And as we build moving forward, as we expand and we create more neighborhoods, let's rebuild, or let's build those neighborhoods with resiliency in mind. Folks, when I look around this room, the people who are in this room are going to be leading that effort moving forward. NAMIC is very optimistic about the future when it comes to resilience. We're very proud to join with you, and we hope that God bless us in our efforts, and God bless America. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
All right, no selfie stick this time. Okay, thank you, Paul, and the National Association of Mutual Insurance Companies for breakfast. Personally, I must admit, I love the bacon. This year, we had 4 companies that helped fund the 3rd year of the Larry Derryberry Insurance Education Scholarships that were presented to many of the students in attendance at the conference this year. I'd like to thank Farmers Insurance, Allstate Insurance, Copart, and Nationwide for serving as our student scholarship sponsors. The scholarship is named in honor and memory of Larry Derryberry, a founding member of the National Tornado Foundation Board and a lifelong supporter of education, particularly insurance education. Here to share a few words, please welcome Larry's son, Darren Derryberry.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning and share a little bit about my father and talk to the students, but talk to everybody in the room, really. My father was born on April 22nd, 1939 in Altus, Oklahoma. He was born and grew up on a small wheat and cotton farm in southwestern Oklahoma, and grew up with a love of sports and a love of reading. He worked really hard as a kid, but as a young child, they discovered that he had a physical handicap that kept him from being able to achieve his dream of being Mickey Mantle Jr. and playing professional baseball. And so as a result, he had to turn his sights to other opportunities to try to achieve some goals that he had. And he joined Future Farmers of America at a young age and began learning skills that ultimately would go on to serve him for many, many years. One of those was a process of learning how to speak at a competitive level, and as a young child, 5, 6 years old, obviously had a lot of learning to do. But through the help of teachers and coaches, by the time he was 10 years old, he was speaking at national speaking competitions. And just after turning a teenager, he was competing in Washington, D.C. in national speaking competitions where he placed third in the nation against high school students who were also in the same competition. Well, this fueled a fire in him that caused him to want to go to college. He ultimately went on to law school and graduated from the University of Oklahoma School of Law in a total of 5 years, including his undergrad and law school career. During the time that he was in law school, he was talked into running for the state legislature. He was elected out of Altus as a legislator, and at the time was the youngest legislator ever elected in the state of Oklahoma. That lasted 4 terms, and in 1970, he was elected Attorney General. Again, he was the youngest Attorney General elected in the state of Oklahoma, and I think that may stand today because he was 31 years old at the time. Now, as a result of that term as Attorney General, it has been said to me over the last couple of days several times that it's very common, and in my father's case, they're Attorney General for 1, 2 terms, and then they run for governor. My dad did that. Well, in 1977, he ran, he lost, and that caused him to embark on a legal career that really centered on administrative law and insurance. He had a practice that caused him to spend many, many hours with many of you in the room. Administrative process, insurance regulatory work became the love of his life. Now, I tell you this history to let you know that he believed he was extremely lucky, even though he had a physical handicap that limited his abilities to function. The students that have received a scholarship in his honor, I want you to know how lucky you are. You're attending a university that allows you to focus on the study of insurance. That's an extremely important beginning to what can be a long career in a great industry. The insurance industry is ever changing. And because of that, I want to give some advice to students that are here today, but I also want to let you know that this probably applies to each one of us in the room. First, you'll most likely encounter some sort of adversity in your life. Just like my father encountering the handicap, the physical handicap that he had to deal with, don't let the adversity define you. Let how you deal with that adversity define the person you are. Second, be willing to think outside the box. In the insurance industry, so many people get into an area, they settle in, and they aren't willing to think outside the box. My father was one of those that always thought outside the box. 10, 12 years ago, one of his clients asked him to give a speech over the history of the state of Oklahoma. He knew it well. He knew he could stand up in front of a large audience and give that history without any problem. But he decided to think outside the box. He created a character that he called Mr. Oklahoma. This character his embodiment in his mind of what the history of the state would be. He dressed like, I would say, Buffalo Bill Cody. Long curly hair, a vest, a bolo tie, a hat. And the history of Mr. Oklahoma ran absolutely along the same lines as the state of Oklahoma. Born November 16, 1907, and on down the road. So I tell you as students that have a lot ahead of you, that one decision caused him to get to speak to hundreds and hundreds of people on a regular basis at churches, at schools, at large clients, as Mr. Oklahoma, all because he thought outside the box. If he gave a boring speech on the history of Oklahoma, he may never have been asked back to do it. So don't be hesitant to think outside the box. Third, the industry is constantly changing, and don't become stagnant in your approach to dealing with insurance. As the insurance industry evolves, you've got to evolve along with it. Again, I'm being limited on my time here, so don't let diversity define you. Think outside the box. Be willing to embrace change and make the best of it. Congratulations to everybody that received the scholarship opportunity to be here and enjoy the conference today. Listen to the speakers, pay attention to what you're learning, and utilize that in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Darren, and congratulations again to all of our scholarship winners. Another supporter of the National Tornado Summit has been State Farm, who each year has provided a generous grant of $5,000. Please join me in thanking them for their support. Today's first keynote speaker is no stranger to Oklahoma. An attorney by training, he was the president and CEO of the American Bankers Association, followed by 7 years of service as the president and CEO of the American Council of Life Insurers. This is after serving 2 terms as Oklahoma's 25th governor. Born in St. Louis, he grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He received his undergraduate degree from Georgetown University and a law degree from the University of Oklahoma. His 30-year career in law enforcement and public service included serving as an FBI agent, U.S. attorney and state prosecutor, an Oklahoma House and Senate member, including service as a Republican Senate leader. He served Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush in the Treasury, Justice, and Housing departments. As the governor of Oklahoma, Keating won national acclaim in 1995 for his compassionate and professional handling of the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. In the aftermath of the tragedy, he helped raise more than $6 million to fund scholarships for the nearly 200 children left with only one or no parents. His accomplishments as governor included winning a successful public vote on right to work, tort reform, tax cuts, and major road building and education reform. Keating also is the author of 5 award-winning children's books, biographies of Will Rogers, Theodore Roosevelt, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Standing Bear, the Ponca Indian chief who argued Native Americans deserved the same rights as white Americans. He is the recipient of 6 honorary degrees. Boy, do I feel inadequate. Ladies and gentlemen, here to present a case study on the response to terrorism, please welcome the Honorable Frank Keating.
Well, Doctor, thank you very much for the introduction. And Darren, I loved your dad, and it was wonderful to hear your very, very important remarks. And it's an honor to be at this Tornado Summit. You know, the compliments that I receive as someone who lived out of state on and off for a lot of my career about Oklahoma, they always say, isn't that the place where all the tornadoes are? And I try to explain to them, well, that's one of the sad realities of where we are geographically, but there's so much more to our state than simply bad weather. Well, this is coming up, bad weather season, and I think to have this conversation and to give all of us guidance and advice and goodwill advice, particularly as to what to do and how to organize ourselves to respond to a man-made or a natural tragedy. That's very important. And what I'd like to do, if it's okay with everybody, is just anecdotally share a couple observations, because we have first responders here, we have people from all walks of the response and the prevention world. And I think for those of us on the public side to understand what that means and how we should organize ourselves, state by state, county by county, city by city, and of course as a nation, is important. I know when I became the United States Attorney in what is called the Northern District of Oklahoma, which is in the northern part of the state, Tulsa is the center of that 15-odd county U.S. Attorney's District in the Northern District. I remember, because after all, I had been in elected public office, it's always nice to have a meal with your adversaries or people you don't know or people you do know and like, because that's the best way to break the ice. Well, I invited all of the county sheriffs who were in the Northern District of Oklahoma, the 15, 17, whatever it was, county sheriffs, to have lunch. So we set up the big jury conference room and had a nice lunch for these guys. When they walked in, they introduced themselves to each other. That just was astonishing to me, because if you have a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, you would hope and you would think that all of these elected or appointed officials, who in the case of county sheriffs are very important to the response to a man-made or a natural disaster, that they would know each other. And they would discuss issues like, can we communicate by radio at that time? Do we know each other? Who are the individuals with special expertise that perhaps one county, a poorer county, simply does not have? Is there any way we can coordinate and we could share technology, information, excellence, whatever, particularly on the healthcare side, together? Well, that was a conversation at lunch. I didn't mean to embarrass anybody, but I said, listen, you guys need to know each other, because we in the federal family obviously will look to you as first responders to everything. State, county, city. We don't know, certainly people that parachute in from DC, what is most important in this particular jurisdiction or area. That's item one. Item two, the Oklahoma City bombing that the good doctor made reference to. No one anticipated a man-made disaster like that, which, by the way, remains the most aggressively investigated and the largest domestic terror case in the history of the United States. You know, people would say, well, 9/11, that was a much bigger deal. 10 times the people were killed in 9/11 than in Oklahoma City, and that is true, but there were no defendants to prosecute. The defendants here were prosecuted, and in McVeigh's case, sentenced to death, and the death penalty was carried out. An individual, because of his selfishness and his hatred for the government, decided to destroy the lives of 168 people, including 19 children. I mean, it makes no sense to me, retrospectively, why that tragedy in 1995 even occurred. If you're mad at your congressman, or if you're mad at ATF, which they were in this case, and ATF used to report to me as an agency, then go ahead, get rid of ATF. Ask a congressman to repeal the statute and go on to something else, but don't murder innocent people. Well, unlike 9/11, where because of the force of the blast, except for those who jumped off the buildings, the residue of that tragedy was black powder. Here, all of the injured and all of the killed were for us, everyone, to see and to try to treat, to address, to extricate, and obviously to deliver to the healthcare facilities for those that were injured alone. But I remember, what does a reasonably newly elected governor do? I didn't know the scope of the tragedy at the time, but certainly you could tell if you destroy a federal building, blow it in half, there are going to be, during the workdays, a lot of tragedy. There's going to be a lot of people injured and killed. In our case, virtually all of them were killed. Well, I remember when I was elected and took office just a few months before, the responsibility of a governor, number one, is public safety and security. You know, the national president is, as we all know, public safety and security on a national level. Well, in Oklahoma, one of the appointments to be made was that of the adjutant general. And we had had a number of experiences in that regard that weren't very good. In my case, I was in trouble because the person I selected was an Air Force officer, not a brown suit, and that did not sit well with some people, and he was a Democrat. You know, horror of horrors. In my day, I had an overwhelming Democrat House and an overwhelming Democrat Senate, but this guy, Steve Courtright, later became head of the National Guard Bureau nationally, but Steve Courtright already was a two-star general and an ace of aces in Vietnam, a very talented guy. So we met together just after I took office to discuss what? Tornado responses, because a natural disaster of that magnitude certainly could be expected and did. You know, we've had two tragedies down in Moore, one in 1999 and one in just a few years ago. Tornadic winds destroyed a lot of lives and destroyed a lot of property. So Steve and I talked about, okay, are we prepared to respond to a man-made tragedy? What are the assets? Is the National Guard in line? Do they know what's going on? Yes, the answer was. How about first responders? Who's the fire chief in Oklahoma City? Who's the police chief in Oklahoma City? How about the surrounding counties? Are they people of talent and excellence that we can call upon to help us? Lord, help us if something bad happens and the people at the top are incompetent. In the case of the Oklahoma City firefighters, the fire chief, in the case of the Oklahoma City Police Department, there was no question about these individuals were promoted and they were the products of merit. And with Steve Courtright, I felt pretty good. Did I imagine for a second that we would have a man-made disaster of such enormous consequence and agony? No. But I did anticipate, as we are in these spring months coming up, concerned about what the weather might do. But I remember the day after the bombing, my wife and I got up very, very early, went downtown. It was misting, and they had big searchlights on the side of the building. And I could tell, Oklahoma City has about 1,000 firefighters. I could tell by other people there that the FEMA Urban Search and Rescue Teams, which by the way were superb, the FEMA Urban Search and Rescue Teams, the firefighters, first responders from around the country were beginning to arrive. But up the street came a firefighter, and he had his coat over his shoulder, and he was walking up the street just past where my wife and I had gotten out of a car, and we were going to step out and just visit and see what was going on. Well, what does a governor do? You know, especially if you're elected, you step out on the street and you say, "Thank you for being here." And the guy looked at me, and what did I expect? Probably that he would say, "Now, who are you?" Which he did. You know, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm the governor of the state." I would assume he would say, "Hey, nice to meet you, thank you," and then he'd walk on. He didn't. He took his finger and he stuck it in my chest and he said, "Well, then you find out who did this, because all that I pulled from that rubble was a child's finger and an American flag." That's what he said. And he stormed on up the street. What did I learn from that experience? That mental health is a big part of this in terms of the afterthought and the aftermath. He was freaked out. So what we did, my wife and I and others, were present and accounted for. Free meals, free laundry, free counseling, free everything. Matter of fact, one of the firefighters said to me later, he said, "You know, this place is amazing." He said, "The only thing missing was a flower on our pillows." Well, the next night there were flowers on their pillows. I'm saying, you know, we have to think in those terms. When you ask young men and women in these rescue teams, your own people and out-of-state people, to come and respond to your man-made or natural disaster to help you, to risk their lives and their health, to help you, you have to show what you think of them. And I used to thank all of them. I remember it was Fairfax County, Virginia. Maybe it was Prince George's County, Maryland. But the Urban Search and Rescue Team, when they would leave to go back to their homes, I always said, thank you, thanks for coming. And one guy took a dollar bill out of his pocket and he waved it in the air and he said, hey, Governor, do you know what this is? And I said, hey, I'm in politics, I recognize money. And he said, no, this is a dollar bill, but it's not an ordinary dollar. It's the dollar I came with last week, and it's the same dollar I'm leaving with. I never had to spend a nickel on anything. When we would put on our civvies and go out to a restaurant for dinner after an exhausting day at the pile, they called it, at the bombing site, the bill never came because people would listen that these must be urban search and rescue people. The bill never came. It was our way of saying thank you as a state. That's the way it was across the board. So for us to have competency at the top, present company excluded, but competency at the top in terms of fire service, in terms of the National Guard, in terms of the police department, in terms of emergency responders, the entire political and the entire first responder family, to have competency at that level is an essential. Well, some months later, actually it was before 9/11, we had an event that was called Dark Winter. Some of you may have participated or knew about it. Dark Winter was at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington. And I think those exercises were hugely beneficial because everybody gets into costume, if you will, and plays a role. I was the visiting governor of Oklahoma, where, according to our exercise, a smallpox attack occurred. This is before 9/11, by the way. And the President of the United States was Sam Nunn, who was then a senator from Georgia. And it was like Bill Sessions was former FBI director. Bill was the FBI director. Well, everything was spontaneous. So how do you get a governor, a state official, to respond to what you want at the national level? Well, you better know him or her, and you better have common sense addressing them. The first thing the military guys did, and I forget who was the chief of staff of the Army, who was pretending to be, who was actually formerly a chief of staff. In this scenario, from nowhere something came, but anyway, in this scenario, the military took the vials of smallpox vaccine for their public relations people because they were going to assure everybody in Oklahoma things were fine. Well, the nuisance governor of Oklahoma, who was visiting the sit room of the White House at the time, said, now wait a minute, I've got doctors and nurses that have to go into hospitals to treat people who are afflicted by smallpox. Many of the medical professionals have no clue what smallpox is. They stopped teaching that in the 70s, since we thought we had that cured as a man-made threat. But you're not going to give a bunch of PR people that stuff. We need it for the doctors and for the nurses and the professionals in the hospital to treat those who are afflicted by smallpox. Well, you could hear a pin drop. Now what do we do with this guy? The reason I tell that story, that's an example of the combat of ideas back and forth where you have to know the parties, trust them or isolate them if they're not worthy of trust. I mean, quite truthfully, and see if you can wire around them. Because when something bad happens, you better have excellent people standing the line. You have to. Then we had a thing called the Rand Corporation put on some years ago, and they asked me to be a member. I was the vice chairman of the Cabrini panel. You probably heard about that, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear event. What was stunning to me at that time, and by the way, the United States Senate had a conversation about our results, but no public hearings. Why? Because a public hearing was too embarrassing. Everybody around the room was a National Guard commander. There were two laymen. The chairman of our group is a four-star Admiral Steve Abbott, who was commander of the Mediterranean Fleet. And the response was an attack, chemical, biological, or nuclear, radiological event, and how do you respond to it? The truth is, at the state and local levels, and this came for admissions of the National Guard commanders, they hadn't a clue. Because nobody had communicated with them what is a radiological event? What does it look like? What is a biological event? What can it be? How serious? What kind of biological agents can be used? From the intelligence community, what do our adversaries have in nuclear, biological, radiological mischief? I mean, what do they have? Those conversations never took place. So our report, and I hope over the years these issues have been addressed or are being addressed, but our report basically says we are screwed. Basically, at the state and local level, we don't know anything about this stuff. And that was how the Cabrini panel ended. Now, what am I saying? That the best and the brightest in the country are in this room to help us as a society, county, city, state, and nation, respond to bad things. And bad things will happen. Whether they are weather events or whether they are man-made events, bad things will happen. It is essential for everyone here to demand professionalism and excellence, no political appointees, people who know what they're doing, people who are trusted, people who are admired, people who are known to help lead that response to an agony event, whether it's a natural disaster that I had in the May tornado back years ago in Moore, the first one, or a man-made event like I had and we had here, tragically, the Oklahoma City bombing. Out of that, good comes if you feel that you did everything you could to respond in real time with competency and dignity and love and humility, and you respond to those who were here, who saw the agony like that young firefighter and were completely freaked out. And that's what we did. Scholarships for every child who wanted to go to college, whose parents were killed in the bombing. Scholarships. And we did it anywhere they wanted to go. We had nearly 200 children who went to college on these scholarships. No federal money, no state money. It was given by people who were in love with the goodness of the people that we had here. But I think what's really important, and Oklahoma City is a Renaissance city because of the tragedy, the aftermath. People said, you know, we handled that really pretty well. And nobody can disagree now that this city is certainly very different than it was in 1995. But what I would hope everybody would take away from this conference, the reality that it's up to you to make sure with your friends and colleagues in other cities, towns, and states to make sure that you don't have the embarrassment, the uncomfortable moment when you look at the people who are responding, you say, I'm not sure we can do this. We didn't have that problem. And I'm very proud of the fact that the competency level was high, but it's always a moving target. So I would encourage everyone to work together as members of the human family, knowing that bad things will happen, but also knowing that the response can be in the order of excellence, of humility, goodness, efficiency, and obviously brain power needed to do the very best job we can at the state and local level when bad things happen. So thank you so very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Governor Keating. And as a personal remark, as a graduate from the University of Oklahoma, I like the crimson and cream tie. So, our next keynote speaker this morning is the director of the National Integration Center with FEMA's National Preparedness Directorate. He is responsible for the policy and doctrine development and technical assistance provided to the support and implementation of the National Preparedness System and the National Incident Management System across the nation. In this role, he has led the development of new national emergency management initiatives, including the rollout of the National Qualification System. Prior to his appointment at the National Integration Center, he served as the Deputy Director for Operational Coordination and Senior Advisor to the Assistant Administrator in the Field of Operations Directorate of FEMA's Office of Response and Recovery. Prior to that, he served as an Assistant Director in FEMA's Office of Federal Disaster Coordination. where he had management responsibilities over the 10 federal disaster recovery coordinators across the country. He also served on President Obama's Policy Advisory Committee on the National Security Information Program for state, local, tribal, and private sector entities. And again, on a personal note, man, I got to introduce people that are highly qualified. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Daniel Alexander.
Thank you. So I saw the picture. I obviously shaved in the last couple months. First of all, it's a great honor to be here today, and especially as we see the events that occurred in Alabama, and following up from the governor's great remarks. It's a reminder that as we enter the bad weather season, it does seem that bad weather season is getting longer and longer, and more consistent and more constant. And those are some of the lessons that we learned from FEMA's perspective over the last couple of years. And I want to spend just a few minutes this morning talking with you about how we as an agency have kind of refocused our efforts based on the 2017 disaster season, 2018 disaster season, and how we've refocused and really centered in on some of the major priorities that we feel as a nation that we need to move to, given all those lessons learned. I also want to say that I'm here representing Administrator Brock Long. As many of you know, Administrator Long is leaving FEMA after a little over 2 great years of service to the agency. In fact, his last day will be tomorrow. And so it's a great honor to represent him. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about this morning is the vision that he has provided in moving the nation forward in building a culture of preparedness. So I first want to, let's see if I get this right here. So this, in mentioning the administrator, this is really the focus of the agency moving forward for the next couple of years. And these are our strategic priorities. Again, Administrator Long, when he came in, took a very collaborative approach, partnering with state and local partners to say, what should FEMA's focus be over the next several years to really move the nation forward, and with emphasis on preparedness. A lot of the things, and Paul mentioned this morning in a great conversation about resilience and the importance of our preparedness mission. And we're very excited that the administrator has really moved this to a priority. And our very first strategic priority from an agency-wide perspective is building this culture of preparedness. And there's various elements to that. As you can see, our investment in mitigation, which is near and dear to many of our hearts here, is obviously a priority in building this culture of preparedness. So the recent, I'll talk a little bit about, and it was mentioned earlier, the Disaster Reform Recovery Act gives us new opportunities, and I'll cover that in a little bit. But the importance of mitigation to build a more resilient communities, to harden our infrastructure for these emerging threats is an area that we're focusing on. In fact, one of the ways we're doing that is we've even reorganized within FEMA, and we've combined our mitigation directorate with our preparedness directorate so that we have one resilience organization driven toward harnessing all of the efforts that I do, for instance, in our preparedness directorate, through the investments that are made from our mitigation programs, all of that harnessing together to help elevate and build resilience in this nation. So we've reorganized, and we now have our Office of Resilience that our deputy administrator now leads. With some real tangible examples of how we're promoting mitigation in our current disaster operations, we don't have to look any further than obviously Puerto Rico. Under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, we funded $10 million in code adoption projects, which will update the Commonwealth to 2018 building codes. In addition, we funded over $79 million in code enforcement projects over the next 6 years. This will also staff as many as about 270 personnel, including building inspectors. So as we're rebuilding these areas that have been devastated, we're really trying to make sure that the investment of all of those dollars are going to help build that local capacity and capability to make sure that we have a resilient nation. We've also at the national level have passed and issued the National Mitigation Investment Support Strategy, so that we can align federal government and the federal agencies and these federal programs toward investing in resilient investments and mitigation and resilience. The importance of all these strategies, obviously, I think you may be very familiar. The National Institute of Building Sciences has now said for every dollar spent on mitigation is $6 saved. That used to be $4. So we're making these improvements, and the importance of mitigation has got to be a priority as we move forward. Another area of focus that the agency is really trying to build a culture of preparedness, which again I think will be of great interest here, is 1.2, closing the insurance gap. We have recognized, FEMA and the entire federal family, everybody I think is aware, will not make people whole in a disaster, in recovering and from a disaster. And the biggest single contribution that can move people toward the new normal, that can help provide the resources is in the private insurance market. And so we're on a campaign through our preparedness division as well to educate in a non-conventional ways, educate as many Americans about the importance of all insurance. Obviously, we've got the flood insurance program, and we're looking at fresh ways of making sure and promoting the purchase of for individuals to purchase flood insurance. But as many of you know, when you look at Hurricane Florence that impacted North Carolina, only 3% of those in North Carolina had flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program. Nationwide, only a third of the citizens, even in our highest risk areas, have flood insurance. So by 2022, we want to double that. We want to double the number of flood insurance policies to 10 million across the nation, and we have efforts underway. All hazard insurance is the priority. 2 out of every 3 homes are underinsured, with the average amount being around 22%, with some as high as 60% underinsured. So partnering with the insurance institutes, the real estate industry, really trying to promote the ability for folks to understand the importance and access insurance. When you look at Texas, for example, as a result from Hurricane Harvey, those that were without flood insurance received an average of $4,000 from our individual assistance program. Our individual assistance program is capped, and again, is not a program that's intended to make people whole from their loss. Those with flood insurance, though, received an average of $110,000. So we all know in this room we need to continue spreading the message, and again, we're utilizing the resources across our preparedness a spectrum, if you will, to try and promote that insurance investment. Some of the other areas that we're building this culture of preparedness is, again, helping people learn for disasters and better learning from our past disasters. And I'm going to spend the rest of this morning and a little time that I have here talking about some of the improvements that we're making as an agency and also as a nation based upon those lessons learned, especially from our collectively our very difficult last couple of years with disasters. Our second priority there is readying the nation for catastrophic disasters. We have many efforts underway to ensure that we just can't continue train and exercise like we always have. What 2017 has taught us is the successive back-to-back storms that hit basically within a 2-month period. Put on top of that the devastating wildfires that impacted thousands of people in the West, really has pushed the agency and has pushed us collectively to understand how we have to train, how we have to plan, and how we have to do better. And we've got efforts underway, everything from looking about at how we deliver our programs to how we also provide assistance so that we can empower our state and local partners to take a more active role in their own disaster recovery. And so there's some legislation, and I'll talk about the DRRA, that allows that to happen. The administrator has often pointed out that 75% of the presidentially declared disasters that occur in this country are are for under $41 million, largely even in our public assistance program. So while those are significant, disasters and certainly significant dollars, when we're now looking at the scope of Puerto Rico in the billions, $50 billion range disasters, we're seeing these billion-dollar disasters more and more common. And so how do we reorient the agency, and how do we reorient kind of the support that we can provide state and locals so that we empower our state and local tribal partners to take that more active role in those disasters that should require less of a federal footprint, if you will. So the administrator is moving forward and is fond of saying that we want to get to a situation where we can federally support a state-managed but locally executed disaster strategy. And so allowing some of the legislation I'm going to be talking about here in a little bit allows us to get there and to do that. Another area that we're also readying the nation for catastrophic disasters is by being more proactive and embedding FEMA personnel actually with our state partners and state emergency management programs and state emergency operations centers. So we have FEMA integration teams that are being rolled out across the country, and we're actually hiring and embedding full-time FEMA staff in those operations to serve as day-to-day liaisons across a whole wide variety of efforts and help states fill capability gaps, provide technical assistance, and be the first individuals there when disaster strikes. And so that we've got that close connection and that close partnership to address what the governor had mentioned, that we're not shaking hands for the first time, that we actually have a unified state and federal team from the get-go, right from the beginning. And so these FEMA integration teams are another approach that we're rolling out. And many of you may be very fond of participating in the THIRAs, the threat hazard and risk assessments. We're utilizing those tools that we're getting on an annual basis from our state, tribal, local partners to help inform how these FIT teams, how these FEMA members can support our states. We're also streamlining other ways that we're, and our third priority, reducing the complexity of FEMA. So this, for anybody who has touched FEMA, either as a stakeholder, customer, or recipient, hopefully would appreciate this, a recognition of how do we reduce the various programs and the minutia and the machinations of having to participate in all of the various FEMA programs, and how do we streamline those so that it's an easier customer experience, and that also interacting with us, even not as a disaster survivor, is a less complex way. So there's various efforts underway across the agency looking at how we even simplify our inspection processes, how we can utilize technology much more efficiently and effectively so that we're minimizing multiple inspections. We're able to work with our other partners who are conducting inspections to utilize that information so that we can speed and aid assistance to our disaster survivors. So this is just a snapshot of the strategic plan and some of the priority areas that has been laid out over the last couple of years, or over the last 2 years. It's really driving the agency. As the administrator leaves, and as Mr. Jeff Byard, who will be nominated to succeed him, is focused on these priorities, we're very confident and comfortable that these are going to continue to be the priorities for the agency, and that and hopefully for the nation. One of the areas that we're also taking a fresh look at as lessons learned from the disaster season of the last 2 years is a recognition that where we could have done better as a nation is recognizing collectively how we integrate the private sector into our disaster response, and collectively that we all understand what are our incident priorities when we have large catastrophic disasters. And so while we have the national response framework, we have emergency support functions, we have the doctrine and we have the architecture, What I think we experience and what the administrator likes to identify as we look at the 2017 disaster season is we failed to align those things to really truly understand the impact of what we were facing. And so, the administrator likes to tell the story that, when Maria was hitting in Puerto Rico, and there were very limited air assets that were able to fly into Puerto Rico, what did we do from a FEMA perspective? Well, FEMA, we had to get our people and we had to deploy, and so we filled those vessels and we filled those aircraft with FEMA personnel, get them going and start doing what FEMA does. Well, without recognizing that we were kicking off our private sector partners off of those aircraft, we were kicking off other entities that were able to that would have been more critical in stabilizing that incident than FEMA itself. And so that lesson learned is, our biggest challenge was communications, right? So, instead of supporting, instead of allowing our communications private sector partners to get in there, get comms reestablished, we were prevented them from initially from being able to accommodate that because we were taking all the resources. So we're now introducing these community lifelines. Community lifelines are these 7 community sector-based approach to understanding these are the priorities for incident stabilization when we're dealing with disasters nationwide, especially our catastrophic. And so we're underway right now as an agency working with our state and local partners to introduce these concepts and align our activities and emergency support functions around these community lifelines. And so we're in the process of revising the National Response Framework to reflect this, as well as additional tools that our state and local partners can utilize. And so we really want this to be the driver of understanding what are nationally our incident priorities, and how do we then understand this, and how do we align both private sector, non-governmental, and governmental efforts across each of these lifelines. So you're going to be seeing a lot more here, and we've already, for this upcoming hurricane season, have reoriented our National Response Center within FEMA and our reporting requirements around these lifelines. So stay tuned for more on that, and I'll be happy to answer any questions later. I also mentioned, and Paul did earlier as well, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. So this is a great piece of legislation to drive us forward in preparedness and resilience, and to address some of the issues that we talked about. The President signed this legislation in October. Again, these are efforts that were underway as a result of the 2017 hurricane and disaster season. And this is the most comprehensive emergency management legislation in at least a decade. There's 50 provisions in DRRA that's touching everything from how we manage our disaster programs to additional preparedness and additional guidance that should be developed for the nation. There's a couple of examples here, especially I think for interest of you, that we're really excited about this legislation. One is that, as I talked about earlier, as we are looking to build the capacity of both FEMA, but also providing additional opportunities for state and locals to build their own capacity. DRA is now allowing management costs for state and locals to increase to help them build that capacity. So 6%, it's increasing, states and communities, tribes to build those capabilities, up to even 15% in some cases in management and administration costs. This ideally will provide additional resources for states and localities to be able to hire staff, engage in activity that can help build that emergency management capability. We're very excited, again, to underscore the importance of mitigation. The Pre-Disaster Competitive Grant Program in mitigation is now consistent and back. It's tied to previous disaster funding. 6% of the previous year's disaster funding that was made available, and it's a consistent source of revenue to help build our infrastructure and mitigate from future risks. This is a huge deal, and we're very excited about that. It also increases the number of activities and opportunities to fund wildfire mitigation. So as jurisdictions receive fire management assistance grants, we are also able to do additional wildfire mitigation efforts with those programs. So there's a whole slew of opportunities within DRRA that's really, again, driving the agency and refocusing some of our programs to help maximize the benefit and opportunities for mitigation and building that resilience in the community. And I think Kyle's here from my staff. He's going to talk a little bit later. We're also helping to provide technical assistance and fund some programs to take a look at how do we understand resilience, not even just the infrastructure and mitigation, but community resilience. And what does that mean for emergency managers? And so Kyle's going to be talking a little bit about that later. And we're very excited about some of the opportunities that there are on how we think about and how we, from an emergency management community, plan around these issues of community resilience, in addition to just building and hardening our infrastructure. So as I kind of wrap up here, and happy to entertain questions if I know the answer to them. Some recommendations. Obviously, we are focused on what we've been talking about is supporting our stronger building codes. Better pre-disaster mitigation protects our infrastructure investment. But also, we're very much focused on individual preparedness as well, and the role that everybody has in individual preparedness. So, understanding who your neighbor is, understanding if there's something that occurs in your neighborhood, who might need some help, who's the elderly person that might live next door, what do you know about that individual? That social contract, almost, that social construct of living together in a society and in a neighborhood is our most basic form of understanding and our first step toward individual preparedness. And so from there, know who's in your community, take first aid class, all of those things that you could do to contribute, because obviously we all know that as we saw in the tornadoes in Alabama the other day, we're all the first responder, right? And so we've got to be equipped, and we got to know who our partners and who our community members are that are going to need some help. So those are just some of the highlights that is going on with FEMA this year. We are very excited, and opportunities like this to come, and talk about those and learn from you. As I said, as we enter into kind of the next disaster season, we are focused on learning from some of these lessons that we learned from over the last 2 years, and hopefully implement a more unified, effective approach. And with our investment in mitigation and resilience, we're very excited about the future payoff that will bring, and hopefully make our nation a more resilient nation. So again, it's a great honor to be here. Thanks for listening to me babble on, and I'm happy to entertain a few questions, I think. All right.
All right, so we got a few questions here. Just a reminder, if you go into Slido, you can put your questions in. You can vote for questions. I'll be looking at how the number of votes to help sort out which questions that we have time for. So, first question: can you operate a selfie stick?
Oh,
just kidding. Just kidding.
Apparently better than you, but that's all right. I'm kidding.
Totally true.
And I hate those things, but not it.
All right. Serious question. What is NFIP and the federal government doing to help make flood insurance more affordable in high-risk areas?
So I'll first caveat, I'm not the flood insurance expert that's in there. Obviously, there was legislation that was passed to fund the flood insurance program. We know that, to continue the funding for the flood insurance program. I think that what the investments that we make from an agency-wide perspective, one is what I talked about before, is promoting those to get flood insurance, even if you're not in the high hazard and risk area. We're very excited about the pre-disaster mitigation program. And we're very excited about the opportunities that the mitigation program has for addressing those homes that are in high-risk flood areas, whether they're buyouts or any other mitigation projects to make those homes less risky. But that certainly does take a partnership. So while, part of the FIT team, and I think to get to that, part of what our FIT teams are doing are helping our state and local partners understand better that risk and where there's opportunities to align federal funding, not only from the FEMA program, but when the opportunity presents itself, how we can utilize those other federal funds, especially through our partners through USDA and HUD, to help mitigate that risk and help mitigate those structures in those flood hazard areas. Clearly, we're always engaged with our appropriators and we know that there have been several legislation attempts to try and reduce insurance. Again, I'm not an expert in the insurance market. I need to have someone from our FIMA up here, but I know that many of you are much more experts in this, that there have been efforts underway on getting in the reinsurance program and transferring and trying to incentivize a little bit more, and conversations are taking place, the private sector investment in the flood insurance program. So there's many efforts that are underway to try and drive down those costs.
Question that we got here is, given that all disasters are local, what are some specific steps FEMA would like to take to expand the capacity of local emergency management agencies?
Yeah, so it's a great question. One of those, as we talked about, is actually provide you additional funding so that you can hire additional personnel and contract for those resources. So the opportunities that the DRRA has made available, the ability to increase management costs to allow you to be able to do that, is our very first critical step, is to provide some of those resources. The additional thing that we're doing, especially out of our area in preparedness, is providing guidance and tools to very specifically address here are areas where to address our low scoring capabilities, nationally. So, we know that housing recovery, economic recovery, those are all great challenges for us nationally that we face at every disaster. And many jurisdictions lack the ability to be able to kind of really integrate around and plan around some of those capabilities, especially housing. So we're working with our federal partners right now on providing some very specific guidance on how local and state emergency management organizations can develop sound housing recovery strategies. We'll be releasing those shortly, just as well as understanding our supply chains, for instance, and what's the impact of the private sector supply chain and understanding within your jurisdiction, and the importance, as we talked about earlier in those lifelines, in the community lifelines, the importance of understanding and planning for supply chain resilience to continue, providing services in your community. So we've got a lot of guidance that's coming out that is specific for emergency managers to kind of understand and organize around that. We're also, it was mentioned, we're running the national qualification system, or developing the national qualification system out of our office. And this is an additional way in which we're identifying actual emergency management positions that are specific to some of these capabilities, like housing recovery, our typical incident management positions and an incident management team, but we're also looking at new positions that can be created and utilized at the state and local level that can help manage disaster recovery, help plan for those things that do seem to present great challenges for our state and local partners and us nationally as well. So there's some real specific guidance that we're working toward, in addition to hopefully providing extra funding.
Okay, so one of the themes that we've covered a lot at this conference is this notion of a disaster, but we don't really necessarily talk a lot about what the definition of a disaster is. So what is FEMA's definition of a disaster?
Wow, that's a great question. FEMA's definition of a disaster would be, we don't really have, in fact, the National Response Framework, as we're revising this, is one of the conversations that we're having about, from a FEMA perspective, what's a disaster from a FEMA perspective versus, what a state or local. Obviously a disaster, I was a local emergency manager, I've been a local guy until coming to FEMA. It's, the disaster to me is what's a very different disaster to FEMA and the national impact, right? Whatever overwhelms or whatever challenges my community. Obviously FEMA, and from a federal national perspective, is really looking at, what are those catastrophic incidents, what are those disasters or incidents that might present challenges to us even in the cyber world. Obviously we're planning for very directly the large catastrophics now, like the Cascadia earthquake event or the New Madrid, a possible earthquake event that will have really crippling, critical impacts to those lifelines that I had talked about. So, in fact, that's a great question, because as we are revising the NRF right now, we are still working through what does a national definition mean, but how does that not supersede or contradict or misalign, if you will, that notion of what a local disaster is and what that means to the local community.
Thank you for that. A couple more questions, and they're coming in fast and furious.
Oh boy.
What is FEMA doing to help people with disabilities and access and functional needs to become more prepared and resilient?
Yeah, that's a great. We have a Office of Disability Integration, and we've got great leadership over there, and we've expanded that office. And so they're very active in both in the preparedness and then actually in our response operations and recovery operations. And so we've got several planning and preparedness guides that have been developed that were just released last year, actually, for the community. Our individual and community preparedness program is working very closely with our Office of Disability Integration to continue to develop some of those programs. When in our response world, when a joint field office is set up and we actually have incidents that occur, members of that team, we have an entire cadre of individuals from our Office of Disability Integration that serves as an advisor to the federal leadership team when they're deployed to these disasters, to ensure that all of the efforts that are undertaken are addressing the disability community. Also, when we set up our disaster recovery centers, that we also have disability integration and access and functional need considerations there. There's also, when we make our grant programs available, our recovery programs available, they have to meet all of the requirements for AFN and for all of those requirements. And so I think through preparedness, through our actual disaster operations, by having that focused effort with the leadership team out of our Office of Disability Integration is really working hard to ensure that those efforts are there.
So, new question that just came in that I find rather interesting, particularly given Oklahoma's unique partnership with tribal nations. Is there any discussion, or will FEMA ever allow counties and tribal nations to request joint declarations so that the thresholds can be more easily met?
I have no idea. That's I know that there certainly have been discussions. Obviously, some of that's going to be a legislative change. I honestly have not been part of those conversations. I can certainly, if somebody wants to talk to me afterwards, I'll be happy to, and I could try and get you a more legitimate answer to what we're currently doing, what the agency is currently doing. But I apologize. I don't have an answer for that.
You can't answer that. I can't operate a selfie stick. We all have things that. All right. So another question is, when will the insurance industry provide premium reductions for building stronger and more resilient? I don't necessarily know if that directly applies to FEMA, but kind of paraphrasing this question is in thinking things like flood insurance programs. Or
yeah, like I mentioned before, we're all, and I know our FIMA, our Federal Insurance Mitigation part of FEMA, is really looking at ways to expand, again, the partnership with the private insurance market and the reinsurance market, and how some of that risk and how we can involve that. I think many of you probably know a lot more than I do on that topic, but clearly FEMA is very interested in that.
All right, and I apologize, I'm going to butcher this question because I don't understand a lot of the acronyms here.
Oh boy,
So,
acronyms.
50% of counties in Oklahoma have expired HM plans.
Hazard mitigation,
Okay,
yep,
that's
plans.
what I would have guessed, but I wasn't going to go there. How can they apply for increased PDM funding if there's no capability at the state or FEMA to assist?
So again, I think some of the things that I talked about this morning provide some of that opportunity, our increase in our pre-disaster mitigation grants. There are going to be additional programs that are going to be announced here very shortly as a result of DRRA out of the mitigation program that will allow for additional funding, again, and also additional management and admin costs that, again, the states will manage, but that hopefully will make available opportunities to hire additional staff, to contract for additional services, to be able to more effectively use those dollars. So by the M&A costs and the stability now of our pre-disaster mitigation grant programs, hopefully will provide an opportunity to increase those capacity gaps, if you will, that may exist. Again, also our FEMA integration teams that are deployed to some of the states. And I don't know if Oklahoma has one. I apologize, I don't know that yet. But also many of the work plans or many of the objectives that states have identified for those FEMA integration teams are to help in this area and serve as that technical advisor to our hazard mitigation programs. So I hope that answers your question, but I think that there are some additional, especially with DRRA, that are making opportunities available to help fill some of that capacity gap.
Looking through these questions, I can certainly see that there's a lot of really good questions in here. We're not going to be able to get to probably most of these, but with just one or two more questions. Let's see.
Make it an easy one.
I was going to say I had the question and then I lost it. Let's see. Okay, so here it is.
Okay.
FEMA is paying claims per county is leaving people on the edge of those counties without assistance. What can we do to change this?
FEMA, I'm sorry, could it?
This one right here.
FEMA's paying claims per county and leaving people on the edge of those counties. Yeah, regarding claims, you know, those are driven, and the process for that is obviously driven by our Stafford Act. And so the ability of the Stafford Act and legally by both the Code of Federal Regulations and our Stafford Act that allows our public assistance and individual assistance programs payments defines the eligible applicant and who can receive those funds and be eligible for those funds. That's something that we can, you know, clearly talk about. There would have to be, just like in the DRRA legislation, there would have to be some changes that would have to occur either to the CFR or to the legislation to make to address additional eligible applicants. So we can, that's one of the opportunities that would have to exist that you could engage in to inform the change of those regulations that identify specifically who are the eligible applicants. Clearly talking and meeting with the state, every case is a little different, and so some of the specifics of that particular question, obviously working with your state program who manages these programs, on the eligibility criteria and eligibility question, but given specifically to that, a lot of that is driven by our legislation, our authorizing legislation that we operate those programs under.
All right, so one more question here. With the president politicizing national emergencies and endorsing that priority is given to states that voted for him, so leaving the politics aside, but kind of with that in the background, what is FEMA doing to continue to ensure public trust?
Yeah, I think so I think a lot of what I discussed this morning is driven and guiding and driving toward ensuring that there is that level of transparency. We, when these disaster recommendations come in, they are vetted. There are certain criteria that have to be met. Obviously, the president, again, has the authority to declare the disaster declaration, but there is an entire vetting process that's done with the state, with our FEMA regions, with FEMA headquarters, to ensure that the eligibility criteria is met for those, and a recommendation, a sound recommendation, is made to the White House for the president to decide. So there is a rigorous process that also is defined in our CFR and in our Stafford Act on the damage assessment process and how that is derived. Obviously, the disaster declaration decision is the president's, but there is a rigorous process and that is provided to the White House when those decisions are made.
Well, thank you, Director Alexander, and to all of our friends at FEMA for helping us build a culture of preparedness.
Great, thank you, appreciate it, thank you. Thanks for your time this morning. Get that out, thanks.
So I apologize to those of you who did not get your questions answered. If you have some free time before our next breakout session, you might try to catch Director Alexander down front, and you might be able to ask your questions then. With that, it's now time for a break to visit with the exhibitors. So don't forget to get your exhibitor card initialed by 30 exhibitors, and I believe they also have to be turned back in by noon. And if you do that, you'll be entered in for a drawing for a $100 Visa gift card that'll be presented in the final session. You can turn in your completed exhibitor cards to the Farmers Insurance booth, and also remember that your breakout sessions will begin promptly at 9:50. Thank you.